Right now, somewhere in your city, a building is being torn down to make room for something newer. You don't think twice about it. Cities grow. Cities change. That's just what cities do. But 5,000 years ago, one of the most advanced cities on Earth did something no city has ever done before or since. It didn't burn. It didn't starve. It didn't get invaded. It simply emptied out, brick by brick, family by family, until the streets went silent. For almost a century, archaeologists couldn't figure out why. The city was called Mohenjo-Daro. It sat on the banks of the Indus River in what is now Pakistan, and at its peak it housed an estimated 40,000 people. That might not sound impressive to you today. But this was around 2500 BCE. At the same time, the people of Mesopotamia were still figuring out how to manage sewage in their cities. Mohenjo-Daro already had it solved. Every house had access to a private well. Every street had covered drains running beneath it, carrying wastewater away from where people actually lived. The bricks used to build the city were all the same size, down to the millimeter, which means someone, somewhere, was enforcing a building code 4,500 years before the concept existed anywhere else on the planet. There was a public bath in the center of the city, waterproofed with bitumen, that many archaeologists believe was used for ritual purification rather than simple hygiene. There were granaries built to store surplus grain for the entire population. And the streets themselves ran in straight lines, intersecting almost perfectly at right angles, block after block, as if the entire city had been planned before a single brick was laid. And yet there are no palaces, no temples dedicated to a single ruler, no statues of kings, no carved reliefs showing a pharaoh-like figure receiving tribute. Archaeologist Gregory Possehl, who spent decades studying the Indus Valley civilization, pointed out something that still unsettles historians today. There is no clear evidence of a king at all. No throne room has ever been uncovered. No royal tomb stacked with treasure. A civilization advanced enough to plan an entire city around plumbing, and we still don't know who, if anyone, was actually in charge of it. So what happened to it? For a long time, the leading theory was invasion. Early 20th century archaeologists found skeletons scattered in the streets of Mohenjo-Daro and assumed the worst. They imagined a violent end. Hordes pouring in from outside, a city sacked, its people slaughtered where they stood, the great civilization wiped out in a single brutal afternoon. It made for a dramatic story. It also turned out to be almost completely wrong. When researchers re-examined those skeletons decades later, the evidence simply didn't support a massacre. The bodies weren't all from the same time period. Some had clearly been buried with care long after the city had already begun to empty. Some showed no signs of violence whatsoever. There were no mass graves, no burned layers consistent with city-wide destruction, no weapons embedded in walls or skeletons. Whatever ended Mohenjo-Daro, it wasn't an invading army. It wasn't famine either. The granaries weren't found stripped bare in a moment of desperate crisis. There's no archaeological signature of mass starvation, no evidence of a population scavenging frantically for food in its final days. And it wasn't plague. There are no mass burial pits consistent with an epidemic sweeping through a terrified population. No clustering of bodies that would suggest disease moving faster than people could bury their dead. So if it wasn't war, and it wasn't famine, and it wasn't disease, what does that actually leave? The answer that's emerged over the last 2 decades is far stranger and far more relevant to you than any invasion could ever be. The Indus Valley civilization didn't die. It walked away. Geologist Levi Ujayasan led a major study published in 2012 that reconstructed the ancient path of the rivers that fed this entire civilization. What he found changed the conversation completely. The Indus Valley wasn't watered by one single dependable river the way the Nile fed Egypt. It relied on a fragile, shifting network of rivers and seasonal monsoon rains, and that network was already weakening for centuries before the cities began to empty out. One river, which some scholars connect to the legendary Sarasvati described in later ancient texts, appears to have been drying up gradually, not suddenly, over the course of generations. The monsoons the entire civilization depended on for agriculture grew weaker and less predictable year after year, decade after decade. Think about what that actually means for a person living through it. It's not a flood that wipes out your village overnight. It's not a single catastrophic harvest that leaves everyone starving by spring. It's worse in a much quieter way. It's your grandmother telling you the rains used to come every single year like clockwork, the way her own grandmother had told her. It's your parents already adjusting which crops they plant, which wells they dig deeper, which months they travel to trade. It's you, growing up in that same town, slowly noticing that the river your family has relied on for generations runs a little lower every year, and then a little lower again the year after that, until lower simply becomes normal. There was no single disaster to point a finger at. There was only a slow withdrawal of the exact thing the entire civilization had been built around from the very beginning. And so, as archaeologist Cameron Petrie and his colleagues have shown through years of soil and pollen analysis across the region, the people of the Indus Valley did something remarkably rational in response. They didn't collapse in on themselves. They adapted, methodically, generation by generation. As the great rivers faltered, populations shifted away from the largest, most water-dependent cities and spread out into smaller, more resilient farming communities scattered across the landscape. They diversified what they grew, leaning toward hardier crops that could survive on less water and less predictable rain. The mighty urban centers, with their perfect right-angle streets and their advanced drainage systems, simply weren't worth the investment anymore. So families packed up what they could carry, said goodbye to homes their grandparents had built, and left. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you if you let it sink in. There was no last stand. No desperate final battle fought in the streets to save the city. Mohenjo-Daro wasn't destroyed in any dramatic sense at all. It was abandoned, slowly and quietly, by ordinary people making the exact same kind of calculation you might make today if your job moved across the country and your hometown could no longer support your family. They didn't think of themselves as living through the end of a civilization. They were simply doing what their environment demanded of them, one practical decision at a time, one generation handing the problem to the next. And this is exactly where the story stops being ancient history and starts becoming a mirror. Researcher Vasant Shinde, who has spent years analyzing skeletal remains and ancient DNA recovered from Indus Valley sites, has shown something remarkable. The people themselves never actually vanished. Their descendants are still here, woven directly into the genetic ancestry of hundreds of millions of people across modern South Asia today. The civilization didn't end the way you usually imagine an ending. The cities ended. The drainage systems and the brick-lined streets and the public baths were gradually swallowed by sediment and time, buried under centuries of dust until they were forgotten entirely. But the people themselves simply became something else. They became farmers instead of city dwellers. They became smaller, scattered communities instead of one unified urban network bound together by trade and shared engineering. In a very real sense, they survived by becoming unrecognizable. There's a reason this particular story doesn't get told nearly as often as the fall of Rome, or the dramatic sack of some Mesopotamian palace by a rival army. It simply doesn't have the right shape for a gripping narrative. There's no villain to point to. There's no single moment you can circle on a timeline and say, this is the day everything changed forever. There's only a climate shifting too slowly for anyone actually living through it to notice in real time, and a population responding to that shift with patience and adaptation instead of panic and collapse. You are living inside a version of that exact same story right now, even if it doesn't feel that way from where you're sitting. Coastlines are eroding a little further every single year. Underground aquifers are dropping by a few more inches with each passing season. Somewhere on this planet, right now, there is a family quietly deciding whether the land their grandparents farmed for decades is still worth farming, weighing the exact same odds an Indus Valley family weighed 5,000 years ago beside a river that was slowly disappearing beneath them. So the next time a building near you gets torn down to make room for something new, remember this. It's not really an ending at all. It's the same quiet, patient process that played out on the banks of the Indus River 5,000 years ago. Cities change. People move. And the ones who actually survive the changes nobody saw coming are usually, in the end, the ones who were paying close attention all along.